Your phone buzzes. You read the message. Something tightens in your chest before you've finished the second line. And before you've consciously decided anything, you're already typing back. That half second. That's where your life is actually happening. Not in the big moments. Not in the dramatic confrontations or the career-defining meetings. In the half second before you think. The gap between what lands on you and what you do about it. Most people never find that gap. They live their entire lives on the wrong side of it, responding to the world as though every signal is a command, every emotion an instruction, every trigger a verdict. This isn't a book about staying calm. Calm is overrated as a goal. What matters is clarity. What matters is whether your next move comes from what you actually want, or from a reflex that formed before you were old enough to question it. Here's the thing. The people who seem most composed under pressure aren't built differently from you. They've just learned something you haven't been taught. There's a space, brief, available, trainable, between what happens to you and what you do next. Inside that space is the only real freedom you have. Everything else is just reaction wearing the costume of choice. I'll be honest, I spent years thinking I was choosing when I was just reacting faster than I could track. What you're about to learn isn't a set of techniques to memorize. It's a way of seeing. Once you see the gap, you can't unsee it. Once you know what's happening in the half second before you respond, you can never fully blame the situation again. That's uncomfortable. It's also the beginning of everything useful. No list of steps at the end of this. No summary to screenshot. Just a shift. Quiet, permanent, yours. Before we begin, if you're done waiting for motivation to find you, hit like. Not for me, for you. And subscribe only if you're serious about building the version you keep talking about. Chapter 1. The hijack you don't feel happening. You didn't lose control. Control was never offered to you. That's the part nobody tells you. You picture emotional hijacking as something dramatic. A red mist, a moment where you snap, a clear before and after. But that's not how it works. The dangerous version is quieter. It arrives not as an explosion, but as a certainty, a sudden, absolute knowing. This is what's happening. This is what they meant. This is what I have to do. It feels like clarity. It's the opposite of clarity. Your brain has a system, old, fast, and completely uninterested in your long-term goals, that processes threat before your conscious mind has even loaded the situation. A colleague's tone shifts slightly. A message comes in with no punctuation. Your partner goes quiet at the wrong moment. And somewhere beneath your awareness, a signal fires. Not danger exactly. More like, pay attention, something's wrong, act. By the time you know you're reacting, you're already 3 moves deep. Neuroscientists call the structure responsible for this the amygdala. You don't need the vocabulary. What you need is the image. Picture a security guard who's been on the job for 40,000 years. He's seen real predators. He's kept humans alive through conditions that would break most modern people before breakfast. He's fast, he's vigilant, and he has exactly zero interest in context. He doesn't know the difference between a saber-toothed cat and a passive-aggressive email. His job is to flag the threat and mobilize the response. He does his job very, very well. The problem isn't him. The problem is that nobody told him the environment changed. So he's still running the same protocol in your open plan office, in your marriage, in the comment section. The rustling in the bushes is now your boss's expression during your presentation. The rival tribe is now the colleague who got the credit you deserved. The survival threat is now the conversation you're dreading. Same system, completely different stakes. And here's the part that should unsettle you a little. The hijack doesn't feel like a hijack. It feels like you. It feels like your honest reaction, your real self, your gut telling you something true. That's what makes it so effective and so hard to catch. When your emotional brain takes the wheel, it doesn't announce the transition. One moment you're driving, the next moment you're in the passenger seat, watching your mouth say things you'll spend the next 3 days explaining. Look, most people, when they hear this, assume the solution is to feel less, to become harder, more detached, less affected by things. That's not what this is. Feeling less isn't strength. It's just a different kind of limitation. The goal isn't a smaller emotional life. The goal is a longer gap between what you feel and what you do about it. Because the feeling itself, usually accurate. Your body knows when something's off. It knows when you're being disrespected, when a situation is genuinely unfair, when something important is at stake. The signal is often good. What's unreliable is the instant interpretation your brain layers on top of it, and the action that interpretation demands. Think about the last time you sent a message in anger and regretted it. The feeling underneath, frustration, hurt, a sense of being dismissed, was probably legitimate. That was real information. But the action your emotional brain recommended? Immediate, forceful, irreversible. And the moment you hit send, the feeling started to shift. Because the feeling was never really asking you to send the message. It was asking you to be heard. Those are not the same request, and your emotional brain doesn't know the difference. This is the distinction that changes everything. Emotions are signals, not scripts. They tell you something is happening. They do not tell you what to do about it. That translation, from signal to action, that's where your intelligence is supposed to enter the equation. And for most people, it never gets the chance. Here's something slightly uncomfortable that you probably already know is true. You've used, "I was just being honest," to defend things you said when you were reactive. Honesty was never the issue. Timing was. Delivery was. The half-second between feeling and speaking was. The people who seem most emotionally intelligent aren't people who have quieter inner lives than you. They've just developed the ability to notice the hijack while it's beginning, not after it's finished. They catch the security guard mid-sprint and say, "Wait, let me look at this first," not to dismiss what he's flagging, to evaluate it before acting on it. That skill, noticing the hijack in real time, is entirely learnable. It's not a personality trait. It's a trained capacity. And like all trained capacities, it starts with knowing what you're looking for. The hijack has a signature. It's different for every person, but once you know yours, you'll start recognizing it the way you recognize the particular feeling of a headache starting, early enough to do something about it. For some people, it's a physical thing. Shoulders rising, jaw tightening. A shallow shift in breathing that happens so fast they'd normally miss it. For others, it's cognitive. A sudden narrowing of options. A sense that there's only one possible interpretation of what just happened. A feeling of absolute certainty that arrives without evidence. For others still, it's relational. They notice themselves becoming very still, or very loud, or that they've stopped listening and started preparing their response. Your signature is yours, but it exists, and it's been happening your entire adult life. The exercise isn't complicated. For the next week, you're not trying to change anything. You're just watching. Every time you notice a strong reaction, anger, defensiveness, anxiety, the urge to immediately fix or flee, pause long enough to ask one question. Where did I feel that first? Not what caused it. Not whether you were right to feel it. Just, where in your body or your thinking did it show up first? You're mapping the territory. You're learning your own architecture, because you cannot navigate what you haven't mapped. And most people are wandering through their own emotional landscape in complete darkness, bumping into the same walls, in the same rooms, wondering why they keep ending up in the same place. The hijack you don't feel happening is costing you more than you think. Not just in the obvious ways. The relationships strained, the words that landed wrong, the decisions made from fear or pride or irritation. In the subtler ways, too. The conversations you avoid because you don't trust yourself to stay regulated. The opportunities you don't take because anxiety disguises itself as intuition. The version of yourself you keep almost becoming and then retreating from because something fires before you can think. That security guard isn't your enemy. He's been keeping you alive. But he needs a partner, someone who can receive his signal, evaluate it, and then decide. That partner is you, the one who shows up after the gap. The question the next chapter answers. If the hijack has a physical signature, what exactly are you looking for? And how early can you actually catch it? Chapter 2. The architecture of a reaction. Your jaw clenches in the meeting before you know you're angry. That's not a metaphor. That's sequence. The physical response arrives first. Muscle tension, a change in breathing, a slight increase in heart rate, and the emotional label follows, sometimes by several seconds. By the time you think the word angry, your body has already been in it for a moment that felt like nothing. This is the architecture of a reaction, and once you understand its structure, you stop being its victim. Most people experience their emotions as weather, arriving from somewhere outside, unpredictable, something to endure or manage after the fact. But emotions aren't weather. They're more like a sequence of dominoes. One thing tips the next, and the sequence always starts in the body, long before it reaches the story your mind tells about it. Here's why that matters. If you only try to intercept your reactions at the level of thought, trying to think your way out of anger once you're already angry, you're arriving at the scene after the first several dominoes have already fallen. You're trying to catch water that's already moving downstream. It's possible. It's just much harder than it needs to be. The smarter entry point is earlier. Before the story. Before the label. At the level of the physical signal itself. Research in effective neuroscience, and you don't need the papers, just the principle, tells us that the body and brain are in constant conversation. Your nervous system is processing your environment faster than conscious thought can track. Threat signals, social cues, changes in tone or posture, micro-expressions that last less than a fifth of a second. All of it is being evaluated and responded to beneath your awareness. Psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett has spent decades studying how emotions are actually constructed. Her finding, which still surprises people when they hear it, is that emotions aren't things that happen to you. They're predictions your brain makes. Your brain takes incoming sensory data, compares it to past experience, and generates an emotional state that it believes fits the situation. It's doing this constantly, automatically, and with enormous confidence, which means your emotional reactions are often less about what's happening right now and more about what happened before, in a different room, with different people, sometimes years ago. Your brain found a pattern match. It generated the corresponding emotion, and then it handed you that emotion as though it were objective reporting. It isn't. It's an educated guess, sometimes a very good one, sometimes not. The practical implication of this is significant. When you feel a strong emotional reaction, you're not receiving news about the situation. You're receiving your brain's best prediction, shaped by everything that came before this moment. That prediction deserves examination, not automatic execution. Now, the architecture. A reaction moves through roughly 4 stages, and each stage represents a potential interception point. Stage 1 is physiological activation. Something in your environment triggers your nervous system before your conscious mind registers it. Your heart rate increases slightly. Certain muscles engage. Your breathing pattern shifts. This is the earliest signal, and for most people, entirely invisible. The goal, over time, is to develop enough body awareness to catch this stage, not to suppress it, just to notice it. Stage 2 is automatic appraisal. Your brain, in milliseconds, runs the incoming information against its pattern library and generates an initial verdict. Threat, disrespect, rejection, unfairness. This verdict arrives as a feeling, not a thought. It feels like perception, like you're simply seeing what's there. You're not. You're receiving an interpretation. Stage 3 is narrative construction. This is where the story begins. Your conscious mind starts building an explanation for the feeling. They always do this. This is exactly what happened last time. They clearly don't respect me. This is never going to change. The narrative feels like analysis. It's mostly confirmation. Your mind is looking for evidence to support the verdict already handed down in Stage 2. Stage 4 is behavioral impulse. The narrative generates pressure toward action. Say something. Send the message. Leave the room. Shut down. Fight back. The impulse arrives with urgency, a sense that delay is dangerous, that the situation demands immediate response. Most people experience all 4 stages as a single event, a blur they call my reaction. But each stage is distinct. Each has a gap after it. And any one of those gaps is enough. I've caught myself building a complete case against someone, motive, history, pattern, before I'd finished reading their email. The verdict was in before the evidence was examined. The most accessible interception point for most people is Stage 3, the narrative. Not because it's earliest, but because it's the first stage that arrives in language. And once something is in language, you can question it. The technique is simple and slightly uncomfortable to do consistently. When you catch yourself in a strong emotional reaction, find the story. Not the feeling, the story. The running commentary that's explaining the feeling and justifying the impulse. Write it down if you can. 1 sentence. They're doing this because they don't value my work. Or, this is going to spiral into something I can't control. Now ask, what would have to be true for this story to be wrong? Not, is this story wrong? Just, what would have to be true for it to be wrong? This question doesn't dismiss the feeling. It creates distance between the feeling and the verdict. It reintroduces uncertainty where your brain installed certainty. That distance is everything. The physical interception point, stage 1, becomes available with practice. It requires developing what some researchers call interoceptive awareness, the ability to accurately sense what's happening inside your body. This sounds abstract. It isn't. It's noticing that your shoulders are at your ears before you've named why. It's feeling the tightening in your chest before the thought arrives. It's recognizing the particular quality of your breathing when you're about to say something you'll regret. You build this by checking in. Not constantly, just deliberately. Several times a day, pause and ask, what is my body doing right now? Not what am I feeling emotionally? What is my body physically doing? This practice, over weeks, starts to shrink the gap between what your body knows and what your mind catches. And here's something worth sitting with. The architecture of a reaction isn't a flaw in your design. It's a system that kept humans alive for an extraordinarily long time. The problem isn't the system. The problem is applying a system built for immediate physical threat to situations that require nuanced, delayed, relational responses. You're not broken. You're running hardware in the wrong context. And context is something you can change. The question the next chapter answers. Once you understand the architecture, how do you start seeing your own patterns? The specific triggers that keep activating this system in your specific life. Chapter 3. Recognition, reading your own weather. You think you're reacting to the situation. You're almost never reacting to the situation. You're reacting to what the situation reminds you of, to what it means, according to a set of rules you wrote a long time ago and mostly forgot about. The meeting where your idea gets dismissed isn't just a meeting. It's every moment you were talked over, underestimated, made to feel smaller than you are. The situation is present tense. The reaction is almost always past. This is why two people can be in identical circumstances and have completely different responses. They're not experiencing the same event. They're each experiencing the event filtered through everything that came before it. Your colleague who shrugs off harsh feedback and your colleague who spirals after it. They're not built differently. They've accumulated different histories, which generated different pattern libraries, which produce different automatic responses to the same stimulus. Your triggers are your history, in disguise. Most people, when they think about self-awareness, think about knowing their values, understanding their personality, being in touch with their feelings. That's not what recognition is. Recognition is something more specific and more useful. It's the ability to see your patterns before they execute, to read your own weather before the storm hits. Think about someone you know who always seems to have the same argument. The names change, the circumstances shift, but somehow they keep ending up in the same place. The partner who feels controlled in every relationship. The professional who always ends up feeling unappreciated no matter where they work. The person who can't seem to finish a project without sabotaging it near the end. From the outside, the pattern is obvious. From inside their experience, every situation feels completely different. Fresh, new. Not their fault. The pattern is invisible from inside it, which means developing recognition requires getting outside of it. The first step is conducting what you might call an emotional inventory. Not a journal, not therapy homework, just honest observation. For 1 week, every time you notice a strong emotional reaction, you mark it. Not analyze it, just mark it. Where were you? What happened just before? What you felt? What you did? You're not looking for insights yet. You're collecting data. By the end of the week, something usually becomes clear. The reactions aren't random, they cluster. Certain kinds of situations produce certain kinds of responses with a consistency that's almost mechanical. You get defensive when your competence is questioned. Every time, not sometimes. You shut down when someone raises their voice, regardless of what they're actually saying. You become controlling when you feel uncertain, whether it's a work deadline or a travel plan or a conversation that's going somewhere unexpected. The clusters are your patterns. The patterns are your map. Look, most people stop here. They identify their patterns and then feel vaguely bad about having them. That's not the goal. Patterns aren't character flaws. They're adaptive strategies that made sense at some point. The person who shuts down when someone raises their voice probably learned, in a specific context, that going quiet was the safest response. The person who becomes controlling under uncertainty probably learned that if they didn't manage things, things went wrong. The strategy worked then. It's costing them now. That's all. Here's the uncomfortable part. Your triggers are almost always protecting something you care about. The anger when you're interrupted, underneath it, a need to be heard that hasn't been reliably met. The anxiety when plans change, underneath it, a fear of being caught unprepared, of things spinning beyond your ability to manage. The defensiveness when someone questions your work, underneath it, an identity that's more fragile in that area than you'd like to admit. You're not overreacting. You're protecting. The question is whether what you're protecting actually needs that level of defense right now, or whether your nervous system is still fighting a battle that's long over. The trigger map is the most useful practical tool at this stage. For each pattern you've identified, you map 4 things. The typical situations where it appears, not just the obvious ones, but the subtle variations too. The physical early warning signs, the jaw, the shoulders, the breathing, the particular quality of stillness or agitation that precedes the reaction. The mental pattern, the specific kind of thought that accompanies it, the flavor of the narrative, and the typical action, what you usually do when this pattern fully activates. The map doesn't need to be elaborate. 5 patterns, 4 data points each. That's enough to start seeing your weather before it arrives. Now, here's the turn that surprises most people. Recognition isn't only about negative triggers. You also need to map the positive ones. The situations where excitement or enthusiasm or confidence produces decisions you later question. The investment that seemed obvious when everyone around you was enthusiastic. The commitment you made when you were feeling unusually capable. The relationship you moved too fast in because everything felt so right. Positive emotional states produce hijacks too. They're just more pleasant and therefore harder to question. The logic engine applies equally to both. Advanced recognition moves beneath the surface of the trigger itself into the underlying need it's protecting. This requires one more question beyond what triggered me. And that question is, what would it mean if the thing I feared were true? Try it. You feel dismissed in a meeting. What would it mean if you actually were being dismissed? Maybe that your contributions don't matter here. And what would it mean if your contributions don't matter here? Maybe that you made the wrong choice, that you're in the wrong place, that the version of yourself you're trying to build isn't working. Follow the thread 3 levels down. Almost always, what you find at the bottom isn't about the meeting at all. It's something older, something that matters, something worth understanding. Because when you understand what you're actually protecting, you can start asking a better question than how do I stop reacting? You can ask, is this worth protecting? And if it is this the most effective way to protect it? The reaction is never the real issue. It's the signal pointing to the issue. Recognition is learning to read the signal accurately. Once you have your map, once you know your weather patterns, you stop being surprised by your own reactions. And the moment you stop being surprised, you gain the one thing that changes everything: time. The question the next chapter answers: what do you do with that time? And why does most advice about pausing completely miss the point? Chapter 4. The pause that isn't passive. The people who seem unshakable aren't calmer than you. They're slower on purpose. Not slower to think, slower to commit. Slower to land on a conclusion and start acting from it. The composure you admire in certain people isn't the absence of a strong inner response. It's the presence of a gap between that response and what they do next. They feel the pull. They just don't follow it automatically. That gap is a skill. It's not temperament. It's not emotional flatness. It's a trained capacity to stay in the uncomfortable space between stimulus and response without immediately collapsing it into action. Viktor Frankl wrote about this from inside a Nazi concentration camp, that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies human freedom. People quote that line constantly. Fewer people notice that he developed that insight in conditions of absolute extremity. He wasn't writing from a meditation retreat. He was describing something he had to forge under maximum pressure, from raw necessity. The space exists. The question is whether you've developed the ability to inhabit it. Most people haven't. Not because they lack discipline, but because the pressure to close the gap is enormous, and it comes from two directions simultaneously. External pressure. Other people want immediate responses, immediate answers, immediate reactions. Silence is read as weakness or evasion. Delay is read as uncertainty or disinterest. The social world is structured around the expectation of fast. And internal pressure. Your own nervous system, flooded with activation, is generating a powerful signal that says act now, act now, act now. Delay feels dangerous. Even when the situation doesn't require urgency, the feeling of urgency is real. So people close the gap. They act before they think, and they call it being decisive. Decisiveness is a virtue. Impulsiveness wearing its clothes is not. The first thing to understand about the pause is what it actually is. It isn't hesitation. It isn't uncertainty. It isn't passivity. It's a deliberate insertion of consciousness into a process that would otherwise be entirely automatic. You're not delaying because you don't know what to do. You're pausing because you want what you do to come from you. From your judgment, your values, your read of the situation, rather than from a reflex that activated before you could evaluate it. That distinction matters. A pause from confusion is a different experience from a pause from choice. You're building the second kind. The simplest physical form of the pause is breath, but not the way it's usually taught. The common advice is to breathe to calm down. That's not quite right. Or at least it's not complete. Breathing to calm yourself makes breath a coping mechanism, something you reach for when you're already overwhelmed. What you're building is different. Breath as a transition signal. 3 deliberate breaths. Exhale slightly longer than inhale. Not to reduce activation, but to mark a moment. To say to your nervous system, We are now shifting modes, from reactive to evaluative, from automatic to intentional. The physiological effect is real. The extended exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which dials back the stress response slightly. But the more important effect is cognitive. You've interrupted the sequence. You've created a beat. And in that beat, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain capable of nuanced evaluation, has a chance to come online. 3 seconds. That's often enough. Not to solve anything, just to shift the mode. For verbal situations, conversations, meetings, negotiations, the pause requires a different tool because silence alone can feel aggressive or evasive depending on the context. Master communicators use what you might call bridging language, phrases that buy time without signaling retreat. Let me think about that for a moment. Or, I want to make sure I respond to what you're actually saying. Or simply, give me a second. These phrases do something beyond buying time. They model a different kind of engagement. They signal that you take the exchange seriously enough to respond to it deliberately. In most professional contexts, this reads as confidence, not hesitation. The person who immediately fires back is often performing certainty. The person who pauses is often demonstrating it. I'll be honest. The first time I practiced this deliberately in a heated conversation, it felt unbearably artificial, like I was performing thoughtfulness rather than having it. That feeling fades. What replaces it is something much better. Now here's where most pause advice goes wrong. It treats the pause as an empty space, a gap to wait in until your emotions settle enough for rational thought to return. But a pause without direction is just frozen. You can sit in discomfort indefinitely without it producing clarity. What activates the pause, what makes it useful rather than just uncomfortable, is a question. The right question, not any question. The wrong questions, asked during a pause, send you deeper into the reaction. Why are they always like this? What does this say about them? Why does this keep happening to me? These questions feel like analysis. They're actually ventilation. They generate more emotional content, not less. They spiral. The questions that work are directional. They point toward something useful. The most powerful one is also the simplest. What do I actually want here? Not what do I want to say. Not what do I want them to understand. What outcome do I actually want from this situation? In the next hour, in the next month, in the ongoing relationship? That question does something remarkable. It shifts your brain's orientation from the past, what just happened, what it means, who's responsible, to the future, what needs to be true going forward. And your brain, given a future-oriented question, tends to start generating future-oriented thinking. Strategy rather than reaction. A second question worth carrying: what don't I know yet? This one specifically targets the narrative construction stage from the previous chapter. Because by the time you're in a strong reaction, your brain has already built a story about what's happening and why. That story feels complete. It usually isn't. What don't I know yet reintroduces uncertainty. It opens the situation back up at the moment your emotional brain is trying to close it down. These two questions, what do I actually want and what don't I know yet, are enough to run in almost any high-stakes moment. They're short enough to remember when you're activated. They're directional enough to produce useful output. The duration of the pause is situational. Minor irritations, A breath, a beat, 3 seconds. Significant decisions. Minutes or hours. Major choices that will affect your life in lasting ways. Sometimes days. There's a cultural bias against taking time to decide. The bias is wrong. The executives who build things that last are almost never the fastest decision makers in the room. They're the most deliberate. Speed is useful. Haste is different. One more thing about the pause that rarely gets said. It requires tolerating a specific kind of discomfort, not the discomfort of indecision, the discomfort of being in a strong emotional state and not acting on it. Your body is mobilized. The energy has nowhere to go. Everything in you is pushing toward release, toward resolution, toward doing something that makes the feeling stop. And you're just waiting, breathing, asking a question. That is genuinely hard. It gets easier. But the people who tell you it becomes effortless are usually selling something. What actually happens is that your tolerance for that discomfort increases. And as it increases, the quality of what comes after the pause improves dramatically. The pause isn't the end of the process. It's the gate. Everything useful, the analysis, the strategy, the response that actually serves your interests, happens on the other side of it. You just have to get through the gate first. The question the next chapter answers. Once you've paused, how do you know what's actually true about the situation? And why is the answer almost always more uncertain than you think? Chapter 5. Facts are rarer than you think. You're reading a one-line email. Your stomach drops before you've finished the sentence. The email says, "Can we talk later today?" 4 words. No context. No tone markers. No explanation. And in the time it takes you to read it, less than 2 seconds, your brain has already written a complete narrative. Something is wrong. They're unhappy with you. This is about the project. This is about you. By the time you set your phone down, you're already in a mild crisis about an event that hasn't happened yet and may never happen. That's not intuition. That's confabulation. Your brain encountered incomplete information and immediately filled the gaps. Not with what's likely, but with what's emotionally consistent with your current state and recent fears. The stomach drop came first. The story came second. But the story feels like the reason for the stomach drop. So you believe it. This is how most people operate most of the time. Not because they're irrational, because gap filling is what brains do. A brain that waited for complete information before generating responses would have been eaten by something long before it reproduced. The fast, approximate guess kept us alive. The fast, approximate guess also makes us misread emails, misinterpret silences, misjudge people, and make decisions based on stories we invented 3 seconds ago and forgot we invented. Here's the thing. Facts are rarer than you think. Not in the world, in your experience of the world. What you actually have access to, in any given moment, is a thin slice of observable information surrounded by a thick layer of interpretation. And the interpretation arrives so quickly, feels so natural, and integrates so seamlessly with the observable information that the two become indistinguishable. You stop experiencing the world as it is. You experience your model of it. The distinction between facts and interpretations isn't a philosophical nicety. It's a practical tool, and learning to make that distinction in real time, especially when you're emotionally activated, is one of the most high-leverage skills in this entire book. Start with the definition. A fact is something observable, verifiable, something a camera would capture, something two people with no stake in the situation would agree on if they watched it happen. Your boss spoke to you in short sentences during the meeting. That's a fact. Your boss is disappointed in your work and is preparing to address it. That's an interpretation. Your partner didn't respond to your message for 3 hours. Fact. Your partner is pulling away from the relationship. Interpretation. Your colleague didn't make eye contact during your presentation. Fact. Your colleague thinks your ideas are weak. Interpretation. The interpretations feel like facts. They arrive with the same subjective certainty. That's the problem. Try this right now with something real. A situation you're currently carrying some tension about. Strip it back to the observable layer. What actually happened? What would a transcript record? What would a camera show? You'll find the factual layer is almost always much thinner than you thought. And the interpretive layer, the part you've been responding to, the part generating your emotional state, is almost entirely a construction. Now. The construction isn't arbitrary. Your brain didn't make it up from nothing. It built it from 3 sources: past experience, similar situations that produced certain outcomes, current emotional state, which biases the interpretation toward consistency with how you already feel, and cognitive shortcuts, mental rules of thumb that work well enough often enough to be trusted, but fail in specific situations in predictable ways. The confirmation bias is the most relevant one here. Once your brain generates an interpretation, it begins selectively processing incoming information to support that interpretation and discount information that contradicts it. You believe your boss is disappointed in you. Suddenly, every interaction gets filtered through that lens. The short email confirms it. The brief hallway exchange confirms it. The fact that they approved your budget request, that's probably just procedure. The interpretation becomes self-sealing. This is how small misreads compound into large misunderstandings, how minor tensions calcify into entrenched conflicts, how you can be genuinely wrong about a situation for weeks while accumulating what feels like overwhelming evidence that you're right. The fact versus story technique gives you a structure for breaking this open. When you notice you're in a strong emotional reaction or making a significant decision, run 3 steps. First, write down only what actually happened, observable, verifiable, stripped of interpretation. This is harder than it sounds. You'll catch yourself including interpretations disguised as facts. She was dismissive is not a fact. She cut my sentence short and moved to the next agenda item is a fact. Get granular. Second, write down the story your brain is telling about those facts. Don't sanitize it. Write the actual narrative, the one generating your emotional state. Who's the villain? What it means, where it's going, what it says about you or them. Let it be as unflattering as it actually is. Third, generate at least 3 alternative stories that could explain the exact same facts. Not stories that make you feel better. Stories that are equally plausible given only the observable information. Your boss gave short answers in the meeting. Alternative stories. She was running late for something. She'd already made her decision, and the meeting was a formality. She's dealing with something personal, and her attention wasn't fully there. She responds this way to everyone when she's in execution mode. You don't need to know which story is true. You need to know that you don't know. That uncertainty is the point. Because decisions made in uncertainty look different from decisions made in false certainty. They're more careful, more curious, less likely to do damage based on a story that was invented in 2 seconds and never examined. There's a deeper layer to this, and it's slightly uncomfortable. The stories you tell about situations aren't random. They follow grooves. The person who consistently interprets ambiguous social signals as rejection has a groove. The person who always assumes professional criticism is personal has a groove. The person who reads distance in a partner as a sign the relationship is ending has a groove. These grooves were carved by real experiences. They represent genuine learning. The person who learned, through repeated experience, that silence from an authority figure meant punishment coming. Of course, they read silence that way. The interpretation was once accurate. The groove is now a liability. Identifying your grooves is more uncomfortable than identifying your triggers, because grooves implicate you more directly. Triggers are things that happen to you. Grooves are patterns in how you process reality. Looking at them clearly requires acknowledging that your perception, your confident, felt sense of what's happening, is systematically skewed in certain directions. Most people resist this. They'd rather defend the accuracy of their interpretations than accept that their perception comes pre-filtered. But the resistance is expensive, because if you can't see the filter, you can't account for it. And if you can't account for it, you keep making decisions based on a distorted map while believing you're reading the territory clearly. The question that cuts through grooves is, have I been here before? Not in this exact situation, but in this feeling, this certainty, this particular flavor of being wronged or dismissed or about to lose something. If the answer is yes, if this feeling has a history, that's a signal. Not that your current interpretation is wrong, that it deserves more scrutiny than it's currently getting. Look, facts don't tell you what to do. Even if you strip a situation down to its purely observable layer, you still have to decide how to respond. But decisions made from accurate information produce better outcomes than decisions made from invented narratives. Not always, but reliably, over time, the gap compounds. The person who can say, "I don't actually know what this means yet," and sit with that uncertainty long enough to gather real information, makes fewer catastrophic errors. They send fewer messages they regret. They have fewer conversations that blow up based on a misread. They make fewer financial and professional decisions driven by fear or excitement that their brain dressed up as analysis. And there's something else. Operating from genuine uncertainty rather than false certainty changes how you show up in interactions. When you're not sure what someone means, you ask. When you ask, you often learn something. When you learn something, you respond to reality rather than your model of it. And people feel the difference. They feel whether they're being responded to or whether you're responding to your idea of them. Being responded to, actually seen, actually heard, actually engaged with, is one of the rarest experiences in most people's relationships. You become capable of offering it the moment you stop assuming you already know what's there. The email that said, "Can we talk later today?" It turned out to be about something you weren't expecting at all. Something unrelated to your fears. Something that required your help, not your defense. You spent the morning in crisis about a story your brain wrote in 2 seconds. The question the next chapter answers. If most of your interpretations are protecting something, what exactly are they protecting? And why does understanding that change everything about how you respond? Chapter 6. What you're actually protecting. You're not angry at what happened. You're angry at what it means about you. Sit with that for a moment. Don't deflect it. Because once you see it, really see it, the entire structure of your emotional reactions shifts. The argument that seemed to be about the dishes, the defensiveness that seemed to be about the feedback, the anxiety that seemed to be about the deadline. Almost none of it is actually about the surface event, and underneath, something more fundamental is at stake, something closer to the center. Your identity. Not identity in the abstract philosophical sense. Identity in the immediate felt sense. The working model you carry of who you are. Competent, valued, lovable, capable, trustworthy, significant. These aren't ideas you consciously consult. They're background assumptions, running constantly, that give coherence to your experience. And when something in your environment threatens those assumptions, even ambiguously, even indirectly, your nervous system responds as though the threat is existential. Because to the part of your brain processing it, it is. This is why the same piece of criticism can devastate one person and barely register for another. It's not about the criticism. It's about what each person's identity has staked in that territory. The feedback on your presentation that keeps you up at night isn't disturbing because it was harsh. It's disturbing because it landed in an area where your self-concept is load-bearing, where you need to believe you're competent because you've built significant parts of your self-image on that foundation. When feedback threatens a load-bearing wall, the whole structure shakes. Here's how to find what's actually being protected. Take any strong emotional reaction you've had recently. Not a mild irritation, a real one. The kind that stayed with you, replayed itself, generated rumination. Now ask, what did that situation seem to be saying about me? Not what did the other person intend. Not what objectively occurred. What did it seem, even irrationally, to be saying about you? That sentence, the one your emotional brain was completing, is the thing being protected. This means I'm not as good as I thought. This means I'm not respected here. This means I was wrong about this relationship. This means the version of myself I've been trying to build isn't real. Those sentences are what's actually on trial in most emotional conflicts. The surface argument is the courtroom. But the verdict being sought, or feared, is about identity. Once you see this, something important becomes possible. You can separate the question of how to handle the situation from the question of whether the threatened identity claim is accurate. These are different questions. They deserve different responses. You can address the situation strategically while holding the identity question separately, examining it with curiosity rather than defending it with reflex. The distinction between threatened and damaged is crucial. Most identity threats are just that, threats. Perceived risks to a self-concept, not actual evidence against it. Someone questioning your approach in a meeting is not evidence that you're incompetent. It's information that they see it differently. Your brain's alarm system doesn't make that distinction. It responds to the threat as though the verdict has already been delivered. Here's the slightly uncomfortable truth. The more defended a part of your identity is, the more reactive you get when it's touched, the more fragile it probably is. Not because it's false, but because it hasn't been tested and survived enough times to feel secure. The person who needs constant reassurance about their intelligence reacts strongly to any suggestion of its absence. The person who's had their intelligence challenged repeatedly and come through it tends to hold it more loosely. Not because they care less, but because they've learned it doesn't shatter. Reactive defense of identity is almost always a sign of insufficient evidence, not sufficient threat. I know what it's like to argue a point long past the moment you privately realized you might be wrong. The argument stopped being about the point 5 minutes in. It was about not being the person who was wrong. The ego protection mechanism is the name for what's running in those moments, and it's worth understanding its logic. Your brain treats being wrong, particularly publicly wrong, as a social threat. In tribal contexts, being wrong about important things had real consequences: status, belonging, safety. The shame of being caught in an error wasn't just uncomfortable, it was potentially dangerous. So the brain developed robust systems to avoid it. Defend the position. Double down. Find evidence for your original interpretation. Attack the credibility of the challenge. These systems are running in you right now, in your contemporary life, activated by situations that carry approximately none of the stakes that originally justified them. You're protecting your ego in a Tuesday afternoon meeting with the same intensity your ancestor would have defended their position in the tribe. The cost is significant, because ego protection doesn't just defend the position, it closes off information. The moment you're defending instead of listening, you've stopped learning. And the moment you've stopped learning in a situation, you've surrendered whatever advantage your actual competence might have given you. The alternative isn't becoming egoless. That's not achievable and probably not desirable. The alternative is what psychologists call identity flexibility, the ability to hold your self-concept with some looseness, to allow challenges without treating them as annihilations, to be wrong about one thing without it destabilizing everything else. Identity flexibility is built through deliberate exposure. You practice being wrong in low-stakes situations. You practice saying, "I don't know," when you don't know. You practice changing your position publicly when evidence warrants it, and noticing that the sky doesn't fall. Each small instance of surviving an identity threat without catastrophe is evidence that the threat was manageable. Over time, that evidence accumulates. The walls don't need to be so thick. The other practice is learning to identify, in real time, when ego protection has taken over from genuine strategic thinking. The signal is a specific kind of rigidity, a sense that there's only one acceptable outcome, a disproportionate emotional investment in being right about this particular point, a feeling that conceding even a small aspect of your position would be dangerous. When you notice that rigidity, ask, am I protecting an outcome or protecting a self-concept? Because those require completely different responses. Protecting an outcome, staying firm in a negotiation, maintaining a boundary, advocating for your position, can be entirely strategic. Protecting a self-concept, masquerading as outcome protection, is almost always a liability. The shift from reactive defense to strategic engagement happens when you separate your identity from the situation. When you can say internally, "This situation is not a verdict on who I am. It's a problem to solve." That separation doesn't minimize what's at stake. It actually clarifies it. Because once you're not defending yourself, you can see the situation more accurately. And when you see it accurately, you can respond to what's actually there. The person across from you, the one delivering the criticism, the challenging feedback, the uncomfortable truth, they're usually not attacking your identity. They're engaging with a situation. Your nervous system interpreted it as an attack because something in the territory of your self-concept felt threatened. That's information. But it's information about you, not about them, and it shouldn't be directing your response to them. Most conflicts that escalate unnecessarily do so because both parties are protecting identity rather than addressing the actual issue. Two people defending their self-concepts, talking past each other, each convinced the other is the obstacle. The moment one person disengages from identity protection and reorients toward the actual problem, the dynamic shifts. The conversation becomes possible. You can be that person, not because you care less, because you understand more. The question the next chapter answers. Once you know what you're protecting and why, how do you determine what response actually serves your real interests, rather than just your immediate ones? Chapter 7. Strategy is not a cold word. Reacting feels honest. It's usually just expensive. People resist the word strategy in personal contexts. It sounds calculating, manipulative, like you're treating human interactions as moves in a game. Like if you're strategic with the people you love or work with, you're being somehow false. But here's what that resistance is actually protecting. The belief that authentic means automatic, that your first impulse is your truest self, that to think before you act is to betray something genuine. It isn't. It's exactly the opposite. Your automatic reactions aren't the deepest version of you. They're the most conditioned version of you. The version that formed under specific pressures, at specific moments, often when you were younger and had fewer resources. The version that learned certain responses kept you safer, more connected, more in control, and then automated those responses so you wouldn't have to recalculate them every time. That version is real. It's just not always relevant. Your values, the things you actually care about when you're thinking clearly, those are the deeper version. Strategy is simply the process of letting your values guide your actions instead of your conditioned reflexes. That's not cold. That's integrity in the actual sense of the word. Integration. Your outer actions aligned with your inner commitments. So when we talk about strategy here, we're not talking about manipulation. We're not talking about reading people like chess pieces. We're talking about a specific cognitive shift. From how do I feel about this to what do I want here? And what move gets me closest to it? That shift sounds simple. It's one of the hardest things most people will ever practice consistently. The foundation is outcome orientation. And outcome orientation starts not in the heated moment, but before it. When you're calm enough to think clearly about what you're actually trying to build, in your career, in your important relationships, in your financial life, in the kind of person you're trying to become. Most people have a general sense of their long-term goals. Fewer have made them specific enough to actually guide decisions under pressure. And almost nobody has connected those long-term goals to the specific situations where they most frequently react emotionally. Here's the connection that matters. Before any situation where you know emotions are likely to run high, a difficult conversation, a high-stakes negotiation, a performance review, you spend 2 minutes answering one question. What outcome do I actually want here? Not what you want to say. Not what you want the other person to understand or feel or admit. What state do you want this situation to be in when it's over? That question reorients everything. Because once you're clear on the outcome, you can evaluate your available responses against it. Not against what feels satisfying or what feels fair or what feels like what you deserve, but against what actually moves things in the direction you want them to go. sometimes those align. The response that feels right is also the response that serves your interests. When that happens, trust it and use it. But very often, and this is the part that requires honesty, the response that feels most satisfying is also the one most likely to damage what you're actually trying to build. Getting the last word in the argument, proving you were right, making sure they understand the impact of what they did, expressing the full force of how you feel. These things feel important. In the moment, they feel urgent. They feel like justice. And sometimes, expressing the full weight of your experience is exactly the right move. But most of the time, when you evaluate it honestly against the outcome you actually want, it isn't. It's a short-term emotional release that costs you long-term relational or professional capital. Strategic thinking doesn't ask you to pretend you don't feel what you feel. It asks you to feel it and then ask what to do with it that serves you. The options matrix is the tool that makes this practical. Most people in emotional situations see two options: the thing they want to do, which is usually reactive and immediate, and nothing. Fight or freeze. Speak or go silent. Confront or avoid. Binary thinking is a feature of emotional activation. The narrowing of perceived options is one of the most reliable signs that your emotional brain is running the show. Strategic thinking expands the option set. Deliberately, before you land on a response, you force yourself to generate at least 4 alternatives. Not 4 versions of the same response. 4 genuinely different approaches that could plausibly address the situation. Some direct, some indirect. Some immediate, some delayed. Some focused on the relationship. Some focused on the outcome. Most people, when they do this exercise honestly, discover that their intended response was usually somewhere between the 3rd and 5th option they generated. Not the best one available, just the first one that arrived with enough emotional momentum to feel like the only one. Here's where timing becomes part of strategy. Not just what you do, but when. The right message at the wrong moment is often worse than no message at all. You've had an insight about a pattern in your relationship. Your partner is tired, stressed, distracted. You decide to share it anyway because you're ready. The conversation goes badly. Not because the insight was wrong, because the timing made it land as an attack rather than a contribution. Strategic thinkers develop what you might call temporal sensitivity. They're not just asking what's the right move. They're asking, when is this person most able to receive what I'm bringing? That question sounds like it's about the other person. It's actually about effectiveness. Because the most perfectly crafted response, delivered when someone is defensive or depleted or distracted, will underperform a simpler message delivered when they're genuinely open. Timing strategy also applies to your own states. There are moments when you're sharp, clear, and grounded, when your thinking is at its most strategic. There are moments when you're depleted, activated, or in the grip of a strong emotional state. The distribution of these moments across your day is more predictable than you probably realize. You likely know when you're at your best. Strategic thinking means reserving your most important interactions for those windows when possible, and delaying others when you're not in a state to handle them well. The reversibility test is worth building into your decision-making process. Before you execute any significant response, ask, if the situation were reversed, if they were doing to me exactly what I'm about to do to them, would I consider that a fair and appropriate response? This question cuts through a lot of rationalized reactivity. Because the responses that feel most justified in the moment are often the ones that would feel most outrageous if turned around. It doesn't mean you never do things that make others uncomfortable. Strategic action sometimes requires delivering difficult truths, maintaining unpopular positions, or setting boundaries that disappoint people. The reversibility test isn't about avoiding difficulty. It's about distinguishing between responses driven by genuine strategic assessment and responses driven by ego or retaliation wearing strategic clothing. Look, strategy also includes knowing when not to engage. Some situations don't have a winning move available right now. Some conflicts require de-escalation before any productive engagement is possible. Some people are not currently able to receive what you want to bring. Choosing not to engage isn't avoidance. It's sometimes the highest leverage move available, creating the conditions under which a better interaction becomes possible. The three-level evaluation helps you assess any response before executing it. What does this do in the next hour? What does it do over the next month? What does it do to the relationship or dynamic over the next year? The most strategic responses tend to create positive movement at all three levels. The most reactive responses tend to provide short-term relief, the satisfaction of expression, the temporary reduction of tension, while creating costs at the longer horizons that weren't visible in the moment. Strategy isn't about winning every exchange. It's about building toward outcomes that matter. And outcomes that matter are almost always long-term, which means they require a kind of thinking that your emotional brain, oriented toward the immediate, will consistently underinvest in unless you deliberately compensate. The person who can ask, "What do I actually want here in the moment they most want to react?" and then wait long enough to let that question generate a real answer. That person operates in a different category from most people around them. Not because they're colder, because they're clearer about what they're building. And clarity, it turns out, is its own kind of power. The question the next chapter answers. Once you know what strategic response to make, what happens in the gap between knowing and doing? And why is that gap where most people quietly fail? Chapter 8. Execution. The moment everything you know gets tested, you're in the conversation. You know exactly what the right response is. You've thought about this. You're prepared. And then you watch yourself say the wrong thing anyway. Not because you forgot what you planned, because something between knowing and doing broke down. And it broke down so fast, so completely, that you barely registered the moment it happened. 1 second, you were the person with the strategy. The next, you were the person making the face, raising the voice, shutting down, saying the thing. This is the execution gap. And it's where most self-knowledge goes to die. Understanding something clearly does not mean you can do it under pressure. This should be obvious, but it consistently surprises people, because the clarity of understanding feels like capability. You read something insightful and think, "Yes, I get this. I'll do this differently now." And then the situation arrives. Your nervous system activates, and capability turns out to have been closer to intention than you realized. Knowing is cognitive. Execution is behavioral. They live in different systems. They require different kinds of training. Think about how physical skills are actually acquired. A tennis player learns the correct form for a backhand. They understand it mentally. They can describe it in detail. But the first 100 times they attempt it in play, under the pressure of a real point, the body reverts. Not to the correct form, to the habitual form. The one that's been grooved through repetition, even if that form is technically worse. The correct form only becomes available under pressure after it's been practiced under pressure, repeatedly. until the new pattern is more deeply grooved than the old one. Emotional execution works identically. You understand what a strategic response looks like. But the first times you need it in live conditions, when your boss is dismissing you in front of colleagues, when your partner is escalating, when the negotiation is turning hostile, your nervous system reaches for its most grooved pattern. Not your most recently understood one, your most practiced one, which is usually a pattern you've had for decades. This is not a character flaw. It's neuroscience. Neural pathways that have been activated thousands of times are faster, more automatic, and more easily triggered than pathways you've consciously understood for a week. Understanding creates a new pathway. Execution under pressure requires that pathway to be the dominant one, and dominance comes only through repetition. The pre-commitment technique is the most reliable bridge between knowing and doing. It works on a simple principle: your rational mind, the part that understands strategy, that knows what response serves your interests, is most accessible when you're calm. Your emotional brain is most dominant when you're activated. If you wait until you're activated to make the decision about how to respond, you're asking your rational mind to override your emotional brain at the exact moment the emotional brain has the most power. That's a bad moment to run that fight. Pre-commitment moves the decision to earlier, when you're calm, clear, and thinking well. You decide in advance and in specific terms what you will do when trigger X occurs. Not what you'll try to do, not what you hope to do, what you commit to doing. The commitment is made when your rational mind is running the show, and it becomes a fixed point that your emotional brain has to navigate around rather than effortlessly override. Before the performance review where you expect criticism, you don't just resolve to stay open, you make specific behavioral commitments. I will let them finish every point before I respond. I will ask one clarifying question before I defend any position. I will say thank you for specific feedback, out loud, even when I disagree with it. Specific, behavioral, observable, pre-committed. The specificity matters enormously. I'll stay calm is not a commitment your nervous system can execute. It's an aspiration. I will take one breath before speaking. Every time is executable. Aspirations dissolve under pressure. Specific behavioral commitments survive better. Not perfectly, but better. Here's something most people don't account for. Your body has to be part of the execution plan. Not as a metaphor. Literally. Because when you're emotionally activated, your body is in a particular physical state. Muscle tension, altered breathing, changed posture. And that state makes certain behaviors more accessible and others less so. Shouting is easy when your jaw is clenched and your breathing is shallow. Speaking slowly and clearly from a grounded posture is much harder. Not because of willpower, because of physiology. So execution also involves a physical reset. Before you speak in a heated moment, before you respond to the email, before you walk into the room, before you open your mouth. A deliberate physical adjustment. Feet flat on the floor, shoulders slightly back and down. One full breath from the diaphragm. Not to perform confidence, to create the physiological conditions under which your prefrontal cortex has the best chance of staying online. 3 seconds. Consistently. It changes what comes out of your mouth in ways that still surprise people who try it seriously. I'll be honest, there have been moments I knew precisely what I should say and said something entirely different. Not because I forgot, because the gap between knowing and doing was wider than I'd trained for. Verbal execution is its own subspecialty. Master communicators don't improvise under pressure. They have language ready, not scripts that make them sound robotic. Frameworks that give their rational mind something to reach for when the emotional brain is pulling hard in a different direction. Phrases that buy time. Phrases that redirect without escalating. Phrases that acknowledge without conceding. Help me understand what you're most concerned about. This phrase does several things simultaneously. It redirects attention from positions to underlying interests. It buys you 10 to 30 seconds while the other person responds. It signals that you're engaged rather than defensive. And it often reveals information that changes what the optimal response actually is. It's not a magic line, it's a tool. One you can reach for automatically when you've practiced it enough that it's the first thing that comes to mind rather than the last. I want to make sure I'm responding to what you actually said. Let me take a second. This one names the pause explicitly and frames it as care rather than hesitation. It models the kind of engagement most people claim to want and rarely experience, and it gives you, genuinely, a moment to access your strategy rather than your reflex. The authenticity trap is worth addressing directly. Because when people start using these kinds of deliberate frameworks, they often feel like they're performing rather than being genuine. The discomfort is real. The conclusion they draw from it is usually wrong. Being strategic with your language isn't being fake. It's being the version of yourself that your values, not your conditioning, are driving. The automatic version of you, the one that fires back without thinking, isn't more real. It's just older. It was formed earlier. That doesn't make it more authentic. It makes it more familiar. True authenticity isn't spontaneity. It's consistency between your actions and your deepest commitments. If your deepest commitment is to respond with intelligence and respect, even when provoked, then the deliberate pause and the carefully chosen word are more authentically you than the reactive snap. They're harder, but they're truer. Execution also requires a recovery protocol, because failure is part of the process. You will not execute your strategic responses perfectly. You will have moments, especially early, especially under maximum pressure, where the old pattern wins, where you snap or shut down or say the thing you committed not to say. The response to that failure determines everything. Most people do one of two things. They shame themselves, which creates emotional activation that makes the next failure more likely. Or they dismiss it, telling themselves it's fine, it happens, moving on without examining what actually occurred. Neither produces improvement. The after-action review is the alternative. Not self-criticism, not self-absolution, just honest inquiry. At what specific moment did execution break down? What was the trigger that overwhelmed the commitment? What was I feeling in my body in the seconds before I lost the strategy? And, most importantly, what would I do differently, specifically, if that exact situation arose again tomorrow? That last question is the one that builds the new groove. Not reflection on what went wrong. Rehearsal of what would go right. The mental simulation of the corrected response, felt in the body, heard in your internal ear, as vivid as possible, starts laying down the neural pathway that execution under pressure will eventually reach for. The gap between knowing and doing closes slowly. It closes through repetition, through pre-commitment, through physical practice, through honest review of failure. There is no shortcut that bypasses the repetition. but the repetition compounds. Each successful execution is a deposit. Each honest recovery from failure is a deposit. Over time, the account grows large enough that the withdrawals of high-pressure moments don't empty it. You become someone who doesn't just understand what to do, someone who does it. That's a different category of person, and it becomes available to you not through insight alone, but through the unglamorous, repeated, gradually more natural practice of closing the gap between knowing and doing, one moment at a time. The question the next chapter answers: what if the emotional reactions you've been trying to manage are actually the most valuable information you have, and you've been treating them as noise instead of signal? Chapter 9: Your triggers are data, not damage. The things that make you most reactive are pointing directly at what you value most. That sentence lands differently depending on where you are with your own patterns. If you've spent years trying to reduce your reactivity, managing it, suppressing it, apologizing for it, it might feel like a reframe that's too convenient, too tidy. But stay with it for a moment, because the practical implication is significant. Most people relate to their triggers as problems to solve, malfunctions in an otherwise reasonable system. The goal, implicitly, is to have fewer of them, to become less reactive, to reach some state of equanimity where the things that currently set you off no longer do. That goal is understandable. It's also slightly wrong. Not because reactivity is desirable, it isn't in its raw form, but because the reactivity and the value it's protecting are inseparable. You can't selectively eliminate the sensitivity without also dulling the perception underneath it. The person who gets activated when they see something done carelessly, they're not malfunctioning. They're someone for whom quality matters, and their nervous system is flagging its violation. The person who can't stay disengaged when someone is being treated unfairly, not a problem with their regulation. A signal that justice is a genuine value, not just a concept. The person who becomes anxious when plans are vague and expectations unclear, not anxiety as a character flaw. Precision matters to them. Ambiguity is genuinely costly in their operating system. The trigger is the value in distress. Not the same thing as the value, but pointing directly at it. This matters because it changes the question you bring to your own patterns. Instead of "how do I stop reacting to this?", which is a suppression project, the question becomes, what is this reaction trying to protect? And how can I protect that thing more effectively? That's a different project, and it produces different results. Here's a concrete example of what this looks like in practice. You consistently get activated in meetings when someone takes credit for work you contributed to. The activation, frustration, a tightening in the chest, the urge to correct the record, that's real. And it's costly in its unmanaged form. It makes you look reactive. It creates tension. It sometimes pushes you to speak in ways that undermine rather than advance your position. The suppression approach says, calm down, it's not worth it, let it go, pick your battles. Sometimes that's correct tactically, but as a strategy, it leaves the underlying dynamic unaddressed. The pattern will continue. You'll keep suppressing. The frustration will compound into resentment. Eventually, something will give. The signal approach says, what is this reaction telling me? It's telling you that recognition matters to you, that being seen accurately for your contributions is important to your sense of professional identity and your ability to build on your work. That's not petty. That's legitimate. So the question becomes, what would it look like to address that need proactively before the frustrating situation arises? Better documentation of contributions, clearer communication of ownership up front, relationships with people who will naturally attribute correctly, a conversation with the person doing the misattributing before it becomes a pattern. The reaction was the diagnostic. The diagnosis points to the intervention. You don't treat the symptom by ignoring it. You trace it to its cause and address the cause. Emotional sensitivity, redirected, becomes precision. The same wiring that makes you reactive makes you perceptive. The colleague who gets frustrated by inefficient processes. They also see inefficiencies that others walk past. The friend who becomes anxious about unresolved tension in relationships. They also notice relational dynamics earlier than most people. The leader who gets activated by injustice. They also create environments where people feel genuinely protected. The sensitivity doesn't change. The direction it's deployed changes. This is what emotional leverage actually means. Not managing your reactions better. Using the information your reactions carry to make you more effective at protecting and advancing what you genuinely care about. The trigger becomes an asset when you learn to read it accurately. The trigger to signal conversion has a specific process. When you notice a strong emotional reaction, rather than immediately trying to regulate it or act from it, you run 3 questions in sequence. First, what is being threatened or violated here? Not the surface event, the value underneath. Not they didn't give me credit, but being seen accurately for my contributions. Get to the value layer. Second, is this value actually threatened in the way my reaction is suggesting? Or is my nervous system pattern matching to a historical threat and responding to that rather than what's actually here? This question reintroduces the fact versus story distinction from Chapter 5, but applied specifically to the value being defended. Sometimes the threat is real and current. Sometimes you're defending something that isn't under attack. Third, given what I actually value here, what's the most effective way to protect or advance it in this specific situation? This is where the signal converts into strategy. You're not managing the emotion. You're using it as input to a decision-making process that's now much better informed than it would have been without the signal. Look, this process sounds linear. In practice, it happens faster than that, and messily. You won't always get to all 3 questions before you need to respond. But even getting to the first one, even just naming the value underneath the reaction, changes how you hold the situation. It shifts you from victim of circumstance to someone who understands what's actually at stake. The emotional fuel conversion is the second major application of this chapter's insight. Emotions carry energy. Raw activation, physiological arousal, the mobilization of your nervous system. That energy is real and it's substantial. What varies is what it's pointed at. Unexamined, that energy goes into the reaction itself, into defending, attacking, withdrawing, ruminating, into behaviors that discharge the energy but don't advance anything you care about. Examined and redirected, the same energy becomes fuel for something more useful. Anger, channeled, becomes determination. It becomes the energy that pushes you through resistance when things are difficult. The person who was wronged and uses that experience as fuel to build something, not as the central story of their identity, but as an energizing memory. That's conversion. The frustration that drives process improvement rather than complaint. the anxiety that drives preparation rather than avoidance, the fear that drives careful analysis rather than paralysis. The emotion provides the intensity. Strategy provides the direction. When both are present, you can move through difficult terrain with a force that people who are either emotionally flat or emotionally chaotic can't access. Here's the part that requires sitting with some discomfort. The triggers you're most ashamed of, the ones you think reveal something embarrassing about you. Those are often pointing at the values you care about most deeply. The person who gets disproportionately activated when they feel excluded. That sensitivity points at belonging as a core value, not a weakness, a need that's fundamental to how they're oriented toward the world. The person who overreacts when their autonomy is constrained, that's pointing at independence and self-determination as something close to the center. The person who can't let go of a perceived slight, often pointing at dignity and respect as non-negotiable values in a way that the world hasn't always honored. You don't need to be ashamed of what you value. You need to understand it well enough to protect it intelligently. Trigger prediction becomes possible once you understand your value map. If you know that ambiguity consistently activates you, you can prepare for situations where ambiguity is likely, gathering information in advance, establishing clarity before the meeting starts, building in the structure your nervous system needs. If you know that feeling unheard is a reliable trigger, you can address that proactively in relationships, establishing communication norms that ensure you feel genuinely listened to, rather than waiting until the deficit has built to the point of explosion. This is the shift from reactive to proactive, not reacting better after the trigger fires, designing the conditions under which the trigger is less likely to fire, or fires into a prepared response rather than an unprepared one. The emotional pattern recognition that becomes available at this level is significant. When you're accurately reading your own signals, you start noticing systemic patterns, not just in yourself, but in situations and groups. If you're consistently triggered by the same dynamic in your team meetings, that's not just information about you. It's likely information about what's not working in the team. Your sensitivity is picking up a signal that others might be too defended or too detached to register. This is how emotional intelligence becomes leadership. You're not just managing your own inner life. You're reading the environment with instruments that most people have turned off or turned inward on themselves unproductively. The most reactive person in a room and the most perceptive person in a room are often the same person, separated only by whether they've learned to read their own signals accurately. The reactivity and the perception run on the same substrate. Developing one without developing the other produces either chaos or disconnection. Developing both produces something rarer. Someone who feels deeply and thinks clearly, who is moved by what matters and strategic about what to do about it, who neither suppresses the signal nor is controlled by it. Your triggers are not damage to repair. They're data to read. The question is whether you've developed enough fluency in your own emotional language to read them accurately, and then use what you've read. The question the next chapter answers. Once you can read your own signals clearly, how do you use that capacity to influence what's happening in the room around you, without losing yourself in it? Chapter 10. Influencing others without losing yourself. Someone is escalating in a meeting. Their voice has risen. Their argument has left the building and taken their composure with it. And you feel it. The pull to match their energy. To meet their intensity with your own. To establish that you are also a person who feels strongly about this. Don't. The most influential person in any room is almost never the most activated one. This is one of those things that's easy to observe in others and almost impossible to remember when you're in the middle of it yourself. When someone escalates, the social pressure to respond in kind is enormous. Not because escalation is effective, it rarely is, but because calm in the face of intensity can feel, in the moment, like submission. Like you're conceding something. Like you're letting them win. You're not. You're choosing the more powerful position. You're just choosing it in a way that doesn't announce itself. Calm is contagious, in both directions. Escalation pulls other people upward into less regulated states. Genuine groundedness, not performed composure, not suppressed reaction, but actual stability, pulls the room toward more regulated states. It works through a mechanism called co-regulation, which is built into human neurology. We are constantly, unconsciously calibrating our arousal levels against the people around us. It's how a baby calms when held by a calm parent. It's how a room full of anxious people becomes more anxious in each other's presence. And it's how one person who genuinely doesn't get swept up in the current changes the temperature of a group. The key word there is genuinely. Performed calm doesn't produce this effect. In fact, performed calm, the tight, controlled, visibly effortful composure of someone who is clearly suppressing something, often makes rooms more anxious because people can feel the suppression. What produces the co-regulation effect is real groundedness, the kind that comes from having actually processed your own activation, not from sitting on top of it. This is why everything in the previous chapters is prerequisite to this one. You can't genuinely regulate a room if you haven't genuinely learned to regulate yourself. The influence dimension of this work isn't a separate skill. It's a natural consequence of the internal work done well. Here's the thing about influence. Most people think about it as something you do to others, a set of techniques applied outward. And there are techniques. We'll get to them. But the foundation of real influence is something different. It's the quality of your presence in the interaction. Whether you're actually there, listening, perceiving, engaged with what's real, or whether you're running an internal parallel process of planning, defending, and managing your own reactions. Most people, in high-stakes conversations, are only partially present. Part of them is tracking the other person. The other part is managing themselves, watching their own reactions, planning their next point, monitoring how they're coming across. That split attention is perceptible. People feel whether you're fully there or not. And the experience of being fully met, someone actually tracking you, actually responding to what you said, rather than their prepared response to what they expected you to say, is so rare that it's immediately impactful. Full presence requires exactly what this book has been building. The ability to process your own activation quickly enough that it doesn't consume your attentional bandwidth. When you're not white-knuckling your composure, you have capacity left over to actually see what's in front of you. Strategic questioning becomes available in full presence in a way it isn't otherwise. When you're not internally activated, you can ask questions with genuine curiosity rather than strategic framing. And genuinely curious questions produce more valuable information than strategically framed ones. Because people respond differently to authentic interest than to interrogation in a softer register. They can feel the difference. The questions that work best in influence situations aren't clever. They're direct and genuinely open. What would need to be true for this to work for you? Or, what's the part of this that concerns you most? Or simply, What am I not understanding about your position? These questions do something that most people in conflict situations stop doing. They treat the other person as a source of information rather than an obstacle to overcome. And here's the insight that changes negotiation dynamics completely. Most conflicts look like clashes between opposing positions, but positions are almost always surface-level expressions of underlying interests. The position is what someone says they want. The interest is why they want it. And interests, unlike positions, are almost always more compatible than they first appear. The colleague who insists on a particular process isn't actually attached to the process. They're attached to what the process protects: predictability, or their team's workload, or their own sense of control over their domain. The client who demands an unrealistic timeline isn't actually attached to the date. They're attached to what the date represents: their credibility with their own stakeholders, or their anxiety about a project that's already slipped. Address the interest, and the position often becomes flexible in ways that seemed impossible when you were arguing about positions directly. Getting to interests requires not being attached to your own position. And not being attached to your own position requires, you see where this is going, having done enough internal work that your identity isn't staked in being right about this particular point. This is the loop that makes strategic influence possible. The internal work makes full presence possible. Full presence makes genuine curiosity possible. Genuine curiosity reveals interests beneath positions. Understanding interests makes creative solutions visible. Creative solutions that serve underlying interests produce agreements that hold. Every link in that chain depends on the previous one. The resistance Aikido technique deserves specific attention because resistance is where most influence attempts break down. Someone objects to your proposal. Someone pushes back on your position. Someone escalates emotionally. And the instinct is to push back, to defend, to argue, to establish the correctness of your view. That instinct is almost always counterproductive. Aikido as a martial art is built on a principle that you don't meet force with opposing force. You redirect it. You use the attacker's energy rather than depleting your own. The interpersonal equivalent is learning to receive resistance without treating it as an attack. When someone objects strongly, you don't defend. You get curious. What specifically makes this problematic for you? When someone pushes back, you don't push harder. You explore. Help me understand what I'm missing from your perspective. These responses do something the other person isn't expecting. Instead of a surface to push against, they find engagement. Instead of opposition, they encounter genuine inquiry. The energy that was building for a fight has nowhere to land. And in that moment of disorientation, something often becomes possible that wasn't before: actual conversation. This isn't weakness. It requires more groundedness than meeting force with force. Because meeting resistance with curiosity means tolerating the discomfort of not immediately defending yourself. It means letting the other person's challenge sit in the air for a moment, without reflexively neutralizing it. That tolerance is built through exactly the practices in the earlier chapters. The pause, the separation of identity from situation, the ability to ask what you actually want rather than what you want to say. One important boundary in all of this: influence through strategic thinking is not the same as managing people. Managing, in the interpersonal sense, is a form of subtle control. It treats the other person as someone to be moved to a predetermined destination rather than someone to be genuinely engaged with. The distinction is in whether you're open to being influenced yourself. Real strategic engagement means you go in with a position, not a verdict. You have a view. You have interests. You have outcomes you're hoping for. But you're genuinely open to information that might change your position, not as a performance of openness, but as a real willingness to update if the evidence warrants it. People can feel the difference between someone who's open and someone who's performing openness while not moving an inch. The influence that builds over time, the kind that makes people seek you out for difficult conversations, that earns you a reputation as someone who moves things forward rather than calcifying them. That influence is built on genuine engagement, on showing up in interactions as someone who is both clear about what they want and genuinely curious about what's actually true. That combination is rarer than it should be. Most people are either clear and closed, certain of their position, unreachable by evidence, or uncertain and open, genuinely curious but without the groundedness to hold a position under pressure. The combination of clarity and genuine openness requires exactly what this entire book has been building toward. Someone who has done the internal work, who knows what they value and why, who can hold their position without their identity depending on it, who can be genuinely curious about someone else's reality without losing sight of their own. That person doesn't just influence conversations, they change the quality of the spaces they move through. The question the next chapter answers: how do you build the kind of mental habits that make all of this available consistently, not just in your best moments, but as the default? Chapter 11. Building the habit. When nothing is on fire. You can't find discipline at the moment you need it most. It either exists before then, or it doesn't exist. This is the chapter people want to skip. Not because the ideas are complicated. They aren't. Because the ideas here require the most unglamorous thing in any development process: consistent practice in ordinary conditions. The daily, undramatic repetition that looks nothing like a breakthrough and produces all of them. Here's where most people's relationship with self-development stalls. They engage with ideas during peak moments. During a crisis, they get serious about their patterns. After a significant failure, they commit to changing. In the middle of a painful consequence, they genuinely resolve to be different. And then conditions normalize. The urgency fades. The motivation that was so vivid in the difficult moment becomes abstract in the ordinary one. And the old patterns, unreplaced by new ones in the interim, run exactly as they always have when the next pressure arrives. This cycle, crisis, resolution, normalization, relapse, isn't a character flaw. It's a structural problem with how people approach behavioral change. They're trying to build capacity at the moment of maximum demand. That's like deciding to get fit by running a marathon with no prior training. The intention is real. The timing makes the execution nearly impossible. Capacity has to be built before it's needed. There's no other way. The gym analogy is overused but accurate here. You don't develop physical strength by showing up once when you feel inspired and going as hard as you can. You develop it through regular, moderate, consistent work that gradually increases in difficulty over time. The intensity of any single session matters far less than the consistency across sessions. A person who trains 3 times a week moderately for a year is in radically better condition than someone who trains intensely 3 times and then stops. Emotional and cognitive capacity builds identically. The medium is different. The principle is the same. Small irritations are the gym. This is not a metaphor to file away. It's an operational instruction. Every minor annoyance in your daily life is a training opportunity that most people are either skipping entirely or using to practice the wrong thing. The slow internet connection. The person who cuts you off in traffic. The colleague who shows up 7 minutes late to the meeting for the third consecutive week. The email that arrives with an edge in its tone. These moments, individually, cost you almost nothing either way. They're genuinely low stakes, which makes them perfect training ground. Because the process, recognition, pause, analysis, strategy, execution, is the same process whether the stakes are trivial or significant. The neural pathways being developed are the same ones. The habit being built is the same habit. The only difference is that in low-stakes situations, the cost of a failed execution is minimal. You can afford to miss. You can afford the iteration. In high-stakes situations, you cannot, which is exactly why you need to be building through low-stakes ones. Here's the practice made concrete. Next time something minor irritates you, and something minor will irritate you today, possibly in the next hour, instead of either venting the irritation or suppressing it, pause long enough to run the first question. What value is being touched here? Not why is this person annoying? What value? The lateness violates your value of respect for others' time. The edge in the email violates your value of direct, clean communication. The traffic violation triggers something about safety or fairness or the sense that rules exist for a reason. You don't need to do anything with that answer in a low-stakes situation. The practice isn't about resolving the situation strategically. It's about building the habit of looking for the value layer, so that in a high-stakes situation, the movement toward that question is automatic rather than effortful. Do that consistently for 30 days, and something changes. Not dramatically. Gradually. The gap between trigger and response, which was milliseconds when you started, begins to lengthen. Not because you're suppressing faster, because recognition is becoming quicker. The pattern detection that used to take you 30 seconds of reflection is starting to happen in 5. The pause that required deliberate effort is starting to feel more natural. The question that felt forced is starting to arrive on its own. The environmental design component of habit building gets underestimated because it sounds mundane. But the conditions in which you make decisions profoundly influence the quality of those decisions. A cluttered, noisy, distraction-saturated environment promotes reactive thinking. Not because you're weak, because human attention is finite and reactive thinking is less cognitively demanding than strategic thinking. When your resources are depleted, the brain takes shortcuts. And the shortcuts are almost always toward the well-worn path, which is almost always the reactive one. Designing for strategic thinking means protecting conditions that support it. Some of this is physical, a designated space for important decisions. Removing your phone from the room for the first hour of the day so your attention isn't immediately pulled into reactive mode. Building an actual transition time between contexts, between work and home, between one high-stakes conversation and the next. So you're not carrying the activation of one situation into the demands of another. Some of it is informational. The content you consume shapes the quality of your thinking in ways that are more direct than most people acknowledge. High-volume, high-velocity information, the scroll, the feed, the constant update, trains a particular cognitive mode. Fast, associative, reactive. It's not neutral. It's building something in your attentional system, and what it's building doesn't help you in the moments that matter most. This isn't a prescription to disengage from the world. It's a prompt to be more intentional about the ratio. If 90% of your information intake is reactive and fast, and 10% is slow and deliberate, your thinking will reflect that ratio in ways you may not be noticing. The stress inoculation principle is worth building into your practice explicitly. Controlled exposure to emotionally challenging situations, ones where you're slightly stretched but not overwhelmed, builds capacity in a way that only comfortable situations cannot. This might mean proactively having a conversation you've been avoiding, not because the timing is perfect, but because the avoidance itself is weakening your capacity to handle difficulty. It might mean asking for feedback from someone whose assessment you'll find genuinely challenging to hear. It might mean putting yourself in a situation where your composure will be tested at a level slightly above what's comfortable. The key word is controlled. You're not seeking chaos for its own sake. You're engineering situations where you can practice the skills: recognition, pause, analysis, strategy, execution, with stakes high enough to make the practice real, but not so high that failure has severe consequences. Each successful execution in a deliberately challenging situation is disproportionately valuable. Not just because it builds the pathway, because it builds evidence that you can handle it, that you don't collapse under this kind of pressure, that the composed, strategic version of yourself isn't only available in easy conditions. That evidence, accumulated gradually, tested and retested, is what produces genuine confidence. Not the performed confidence of someone who hasn't been tested. The quieter, more durable confidence of someone who has been tested, failed, recovered, adjusted, and succeeded. Who has the receipts. Here's something slightly uncomfortable that you probably recognize. You already know which situations consistently reveal your worst patterns. The type of person who reliably gets under your skin. The kind of conversation that always ends badly. The category of decision you consistently make from the wrong place. You've known for a while, and you've mostly been managing around them rather than training through them. Managing around your difficult situations keeps you functional. Training through them makes you capable. They're different destinations. The daily training protocol doesn't require massive time investment. It requires consistent attention. 5 minutes in the morning asking, where today am I likely to be triggered? What's my pre-commitment for that situation? And 5 minutes in the evening asking, where today did my execution hold, and where did it break down? What does the breakdown tell me about where to focus next? That's it. 10 minutes of deliberate attention to your own patterns, daily. The compounding effect of that consistency, sustained over months and years, is not linear. It's geometric. Because each piece of self-knowledge informs the next. Each execution success raises the baseline. Each honest analysis of failure closes a gap that previously cost you repeatedly. The habit, built when nothing is on fire, is the only thing available to you when everything is on fire. The question the next chapter answers. What happens to all of this when pressure isn't abstract? When the stakes are real, time is short, and your system is being tested at the limit of what you've built. Chapter 12. Pressure, Clarity, and the Myth of Calm. The surgeon's hands don't shake because they're relaxed. They don't shake because they've practiced more than they've worried. That distinction matters more than most people realize. The composure you observe in elite performers under pressure isn't the composure of someone who doesn't feel the pressure. It's the composure of someone whose preparation has made the pressure manageable. They feel it. They feel it acutely. What they don't do is confuse the feeling of pressure with the incapacity to think clearly. The goal is not calm. The goal is clarity. These are related, but not identical. Calm is an emotional state, the absence or reduction of activation. Clarity is a cognitive capacity, the ability to perceive accurately and think effectively. You can have clarity without calm. In fact, some of the clearest thinking humans produce happens in conditions of significant pressure. Not because pressure is helpful per se, but because it narrows attention to what's essential and concentrates resources in a way that more comfortable conditions don't always demand. What pressure destroys isn't intelligence, it's access. Under pressure, the pathways to your prefrontal cortex, to your capacity for nuanced analysis, flexible thinking, and deliberate strategy, become less accessible because your nervous system is diverting resources toward immediate threat response. The intelligence is still there. The filing cabinet is still there. You just can't open it as easily when the building feels like it's on fire. Training changes the accessibility. Not by making you immune to the pressure response. That's not achievable or even desirable, because the pressure response includes genuine performance enhancements in the right doses. Training changes it by building pathways that are robust enough to remain partially accessible even when the stress response is running. You can still get to the filing cabinet. It takes more effort, but you've practiced opening it under increasing levels of difficulty, and now you can. Pressure doesn't reveal character. It reveals preparation. The two look identical from the outside, which is why people attribute composure under pressure to personality rather than practice. They see someone handling a crisis with apparent ease and conclude that person is built differently. They might be. Or they might simply have prepared for this in conditions where it wasn't a crisis, until the capacity was deeply enough grooved to be accessible when it became one. The threat opportunity radar is the first tool in your high-pressure protocol. Pressure creates a distortion in how you perceive situations. Specifically, it biases perception toward threat. Everything looks more dangerous, more urgent, more consequential than it might actually be. Time feels shorter. Stakes feel higher. Options feel fewer. This distortion is not imaginary. It's a genuine feature of the stress response. But it's also not accurate reporting about reality. It's your nervous system's threat model running at high amplification. The radar recalibration is a single question asked before any high-pressure response. Is this actually as urgent as it feels? Not to dismiss the urgency, sometimes it is exactly as urgent as it feels. But often, even in genuinely high-stakes situations, there's more time than the activated nervous system is reporting. The surgeon has a moment to assess before the first cut. The negotiator has a moment to think before speaking. The leader has a moment to orient before issuing direction. These moments are real even when they don't feel available. Finding those moments, claiming them against the pressure that says there's no time, is a trained skill. And the training, as you've probably noticed, is consistent across every chapter in this book. The pause, the question, the deliberate shift from automatic to intentional. The pressure pause is different from the pause in ordinary conditions, not structurally. One deliberate breath, one orienting question, but phenomenologically, it takes more. When your nervous system is flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, a single breath doesn't feel like enough. The urgency is screaming. Every instinct is pushing toward immediate action. The pause feels, in that state, almost dangerous, like you're wasting precious time. You're not. You're claiming the only resource that high-pressure situations routinely steal from you. The one breath, the one question, buys you access to capacities that make everything that follows more effective. The decision made after 5 seconds of genuine orientation outperforms the decision made in the first instant of activation. Not always, but with a reliability that compounds over time into a substantial advantage. The single breath isn't about relaxation, it's about transition. Marking the boundary between reactive mode and evaluative mode, telling your system, we are now switching from automatic to intentional. The physiological effect is real but secondary. The signal effect, the deliberate interruption of the automatic sequence, is the primary mechanism. Under genuine pressure, the analysis phase has to be compressed. You don't have time for the full fact versus story process. You don't have time to generate 5 alternative interpretations. You need essential analysis. The ability to strip a complex situation down to its 2 or 3 genuinely load-bearing factors. The questions that do this most efficiently under pressure are: what is actually at stake here? Not what feels at stake, but what is. What's the single highest leverage action available to me right now? And what's the worst-case scenario if I'm wrong? And is it recoverable? Those 3 questions, run fast, produce better decisions under pressure than either the unexamined reactive response or the attempt to run full analysis when conditions don't allow it. Simple strategies executed well beat complex strategies executed poorly. This principle, under pressure, becomes almost a law. The elaborate plan you developed in calm conditions will not execute cleanly when you're flooded with adrenaline and the situation is moving faster than you anticipated. What executes under pressure is what's been practiced until it's simple, until it fits in one sentence, until you can hold it in working memory while your nervous system is running hot. Elite performers across domains have internalized this. The fighter pilot's checklist isn't elaborate under emergency conditions. It's the 3 most critical items, in order, practiced until they're automatic. The ER physician's initial assessment isn't comprehensive. It's the vital functions, in sequence, evaluated fast enough to identify what's immediately life-threatening. The experienced negotiator's approach under hostile conditions isn't sophisticated multi-level strategy. It's the 2 or 3 moves that have worked in similar conditions, deployed with full commitment. Simplicity isn't a failure of preparation. It's the product of thorough preparation compressed into executable form. The mental fortress is what you build in the space between your self-concept and the pressure being applied to it. In genuinely high-pressure situations, a hostile negotiation, a performance crisis, public criticism, a moment of leadership failure, the pressure often isn't just situational, it's personal. It's aimed at you, at your competence, your judgment, your worth. And if your self-concept is load-bearing in the ways Chapter 6 described, that personal dimension of pressure can be more destabilizing than the situational one. The fortress is built from a simple distinction: what is being evaluated here, and what is being threatened. Your performance in this situation can be evaluated, fairly or unfairly, accurately or inaccurately. Your identity as a person is not on trial. Those 2 things are separable. Keeping them separated under pressure is the fortress. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to how things go. It means refusing to let the outcome of this situation determine the verdict on your worth. The verdict on your worth was never available to this situation. It wasn't on offer. You don't surrender it to outcomes, however significant. That distinction, held clearly under maximum pressure, creates a stability that is visible to others and that changes how they relate to you. People who are undefended about outcomes because they're secure about their identity operate differently under pressure. They're more creative because they're not spending cognitive resources on self-protection. They're more receptive to information because the information can't damage something that isn't at stake. They're more decisive because the decision isn't burdened with what it might mean about them. Pressure leadership becomes natural from this position. Not because you're unaffected by what's happening, you feel it fully, but because your stability provides an anchor for others whose self-concepts are more caught up in the turbulence. You become the fixed point, not through performance, through actual groundedness. The recovery and motion technique addresses what happens when you lose the thread under pressure. When you've been running on adrenaline and you notice your thinking has become less clear, your responses less strategic, your execution less clean. Rather than trying to push through or pretending the degradation isn't happening, you take what's available: a brief transition, a delegation, a shift of focus for even 60 seconds, and use it to partially reset. Not full recovery, partial reset. Enough to reorient. Enough to ask again, what do I actually want here? Enough to compress the analysis one more time and recommit to the simplest version of the strategy. The myth of calm is that the goal is to feel calm under pressure. It isn't. The goal is to remain effective. Feeling calm is a byproduct of effectiveness in some conditions. In others, you will feel the full weight of the pressure and remain effective anyway. Not because you've transcended your nervous system, because you've built enough capacity through the unglamorous, consistent, low-stakes training of the previous chapter and all the chapters before it, that even at maximum demand, there's still something there to work with. That something is what you've been building this entire time. Not a technique, a capacity, a way of meeting difficulty that's yours now, not borrowed from a good moment, built through all of them. The question the conclusion answers isn't really a question. It's a return to the beginning, to the phone, to the buzz, to the half second before everything starts.